الحمد لله القديم الباري ثم صلاته على المختار وبعد هاك سيرة الرسول منظومة موجزة الفصول. In those two lines, Imam Ibn Abi al-Izz al-Hanafi rahimahullah started his urjuza or his nazm, which is one of the Islamic arts actually, to summarize a branch of knowledge in lines of poetry. But it doesn't have exactly the same rules of poetry, because poetry must be on the same rhythm and the same end. But when it's used like this, it goes nazm or rajz, still same rhythm, but with different ends. So it's not necessarily the same, ends with the same letter, but it's still the same rhythm. So he started the first line, as every single Muslim should start his speech, by praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the way he deserves. As the Prophet ﷺ used to start his speech, and the Sahaba and Tabi'un and all righteous Muslims throughout Islamic history. So he thanked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and praised him the way he deserves. And then he sent his salah and salam upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then in the second line, he immediately jumped into the topic. And he said, this is the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, so take it. Take the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ in an eloquent and brief way. And we will see, subhanAllah, it's very brief, but it's inclusive. So after those two lines, he started discussing the birth of the Prophet ﷺ. As many scholars did, as many scholars started talking about Seerah, started with the topic of the birth of the Prophet ﷺ. But in my humble opinion, I believe that we have to start before that, before the birth of the Prophet ﷺ. And if we want to take the best way, so we have to go all the way back to Ibrahim alayhi salam and to the verses that I recited in Isha, and to understand the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam and the dua that Ibrahim alayhi salam made. Ibrahim and Ismail alayhi salam, they made a dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to send to this ummah a prophet from among themselves to recite Allah's verses to them and to teach them knowledge, to teach them al-kitab and al-hikmah, وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ, and to purify them. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answered their dua by sending Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam many centuries after their dua. So, of course, that will take long time to start with. I'll just skip through and I will start one step before the birth of the Prophet ﷺ, which is so important because we have to understand what's the situation was on earth, on Arabia specifically, where the Prophet ﷺ came from, and in the world in general, before his birth and before his message sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So, to understand how it was, we can listen to this hadith, authentic hadith from Sahih Muslim. When the Prophet ﷺ said, it's a long hadith, but part of that hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, وَإِنَّ اللَّهَ نَظَرَ إِلَىٰ أَهْلِ الْأَرْضِ فَمَقَتَهُمْ عَرَبَهُمْ وَعَجَمَهُمْ إِلَّا بَقَايَا مِنْ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ. It means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looked at the people of earth and maqatahum means hated them so much. Arabahum wa ajamahum, Arabs and non-Arabs, everyone, all people on earth, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hated them so much before the message of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And there is one exception, إِلَّا بَقَايَا مِنْ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ, except remnants from the people of the book who remained on the true religion. So this hadith gives us clear picture that humanity was in complete darkness. That's why we call it, in the Islamic literature, we call it al-jahiliyyah. And al-jahiliyyah, it's a term, refers to the pre-Islam ignorance, pre-Islam darkness. That was the normal. Injustice was normal, very normal. And even if we study non-Islamic history, we can see how the world was before the time of the Prophet ﷺ. When we read the stories, it's hard to believe. Some of the stories are mentioned even in the Quran. And I would like to highlight just one of the stories to understand the overall darkness and the overall injustice on earth at that time, which is the story of Ashab al-Ukhdud. And in some narrations that this story happened 70 years before the birth of the Prophet ﷺ. Briefly, we all know the story of Ashab al-Ukhdud, how tens of people were killed, were literally burned to death because they believed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's it. Only one reason. They believed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so they were killed. They were burned to death. And this story took place in Yemen, southern of Arabia. And as many narrations mention and give more details about the story, of course I'm not going to mention the story in details, but just in general, that tyrant king was a Jew. And those believers were true Christians. And he killed them all because they followed Allah's religion. That's the kind of injustice. And by the way, they were not only men, women, even infants were burned to death. Just to imagine the kind of injustice, the kind of darkness that was on earth before the message of the Prophet ﷺ. And of course, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described, the believers who were killed, they were the real winners. And what we know from history, what happened after that, this tyrant was defeated, was conquered by Christians from Abyssinia. And then we know that after that, the Abyssinian Christians came with their leader, his name Abraha al-Ashram, the one who built Al-Qullays, the massive church in Yemen. Still remnants of that church, by the way, exist until today in Yemen. And he built this massive church to make it the most important place in Arabia. And he wanted everyone to come and visit this church, i.e. make pilgrimage to Al-Qullays, to his church. So only one obstacle was in his face. That is, all Arabs, of course, shirk was common. They worshipped idols, but they still had some ideas or some true from the religion of Ibrahim and Ismail alayhim salam. They knew that the Kaaba is the house of Allah and we have to make Hajj towards Kaaba. And they kept this ritual as sacred ritual. And they protected this ritual. So Abraha al-Ashram wanted to destroy the Kaaba in order to make his church the most important place. And then the incident of the elephant took place. And we all know the details. And why I mention this? Just to understand the overall picture around the world. Read the history of the Romans, the Persians, the history of India, the history of all the world was in complete darkness. And in this year, the year of the elephant, the Prophet ﷺ was born. And subhanAllah, we see after a few decades, everything changed around the world. The light of Islam came, and the power of justice was there on earth, was there in application, not only written. So, one more reason that we have to learn about Jahiliyyah before we learn about Islam. There is an important statement by Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu anhu. And we all know who is Umar ibn al-Khattab. The Prophet ﷺ once said, if the angels would talk to someone from this ummah, they would talk to Umar ibn al-Khattab. He was full of wisdom, full of knowledge. So Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu anhu said, إنما تنقض عرى الإسلام عروة عروة إذا نشأ في الإسلام من لم يعرف الجاهلية. The bonds of Islam gets broken one by one if a Muslim generation grows up without knowing the Jahiliyyah. So when we don't know the Jahiliyyah, we only know Islam, it's not enough. Because everything, subhanAllah, everything in humans' minds is relative. So we don't appreciate Islam, we don't appreciate the light of Islam if we don't know the darkness of Jahiliyyah. So that's why it is very important to know more details about Jahiliyyah. What was happening actually, how people used to think, how people used to treat each another. So let's go back now to the lines of poetry. Now he started with the birth of the Prophet ﷺ. He said, مولده في عاشر الفضيل ربيع الأول عام الفيل. He was born in the 10th of Rabi' al-Awwal. And Rabi' al-Awwal is the 3rd month in the Arabic calendar. Then he said, لكنما المشهور ثاني عشره. But the most famous date is not this. So he mentioned different opinions. So the first opinion says that the Prophet ﷺ was born in the 10th of Rabi' al-Awwal. And the famous opinion says that the Prophet ﷺ was born in the 12th of Rabi' al-Awwal. في يوم الاثنين طلوع فجره. In the Fajr time, in the day of Monday. And of course, from the authentic hadith, we know that for sure the Prophet ﷺ was born on Monday. ووافق العشرين من نيسان. And it's equivalent in the Christian calendar. It's April 20th in the year 571 CE. ووافق العشرين من نيسان وقبله حين أبيه وقبله حين أبيه حان. Subhanallah, he was born in that date, he mentioned, and then in half a line, he gave a very important detail, which is before he was born, his father died. And subhanallah, just whenever you go through any difficulty, remember the Prophet ﷺ. His hardship and difficulty started even before he was born. His father died, so he was born as an orphan. وبعد عامين غدا فطيمة جاءت به مرضعه سليمة. So he jumped quickly. As he said, it is very brief. So he mentioned now his father died before he was born. Then he said, he skipped a couple years, and we all know that it was the custom of people of Mecca to give their kids to be breastfed from people outside of the city. Why? Because of two reasons. It's healthier to live away from the city, especially in the early ages, so it's safer. It's more common to live in that time. And the second reason is to master the pure Arabic language. Because Mecca was a big city, people coming from all around, just like today, by the way, same situation, subhanAllah. The language of Mecca is all languages. There is no one language, because everybody comes from everywhere. So, the Prophet ﷺ was taken by Halima al-Sa'diyah from Bani Sa'd. And she brought him after 2 years, after she completed the breastfeeding. But then he mentioned here something, and we can understand another thing between the lines. So he said, she took him back to his mother after 2 years, and then she took him again with her. She wanted Muhammad ﷺ to stay with her. Why? Because she saw the blessings of the Prophet ﷺ from day one, when he was a little infant. She saw miracles. Everything in their life changed. Everything in the life of this family changed completely after having the Prophet ﷺ, even when he was an infant. So he says, جاءت به مرضعه سليما حليمة لأمه وعادت به لأهلها كما أرادت. And she took him back with her as she wanted. فبعد شهرين انشقاق بطنه وقيل بعد 4 من سنه. And then one famous incident happened, which is the opening of the chest of the Prophet ﷺ when he was a little kid. And again he mentioned 2 opinions. 2 months after that, or when he was 4 years old. It was between that time. And it's a famous incident when angels opened the chest of the Prophet ﷺ, they took his heart out and they cleansed it, and then they brought it back. They put it back in his chest. And obviously they were terrified because he was playing with other kids. And when they saw that Muhammad was killed, they just ran to Halima and told her, Muhammad has been killed. And they were scared so much. And they came quickly running to see what happened. And they found the Prophet ﷺ, okay, nothing happened to him. He's just walking. He was terrified as well, but he was walking. So what they thought at that time, it's from jinn, from shayateen, what's happening to him. So she took him quickly back to his mother. She didn't want to take responsibility of what's going to happen to this boy. So last 2 lines, inshallah, or last 2 lines today, inshallah. وبعد 6 مع شهر جاء وفاة أمه على الأبواء. And subhanallah, as if it's not enough of difficulty to be born as an orphan, when he was 6 years old, his mother took him to visit Medina, to visit the uncles of his grandfather, the uncles of Abdul Muttalib. And in the way back to Mecca, she died in the middle of the way. And she was buried there when he was 6 years old. Just imagine, 6 years old. Then obviously his grandfather took care of him, and he became the actual father. وجده للأب عبد المطلب بعد 8 مات من غير كذب. And his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, died when the Prophet ﷺ reached the age of 8. Subhanallah. Look how difficult it is. So whenever we see in our life, it's nothing compared to the Prophet ﷺ. So this is the part that I want to mention, but before I finish, I just want to quickly mention the full name of the Prophet ﷺ and the name of his mother. So we know that because some people think that his mother is from Medina, but she's not. She's from Mecca, and she's from almost the same branch of Quraysh as Abdullah, the father of the Prophet ﷺ. So his name is Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn Abdul Muttalib ibn Hashim ibn Abd Manaf ibn Qusay ibn Kilab. And this name, Kilab, were both lineages meet. His father and his mother. They meet in Kilab. Ibn Kilab, ibn Murrah, ibn Ka'b, ibn Lu'ay, ibn Ghalib, ibn Fihr, ibn Malik, ibn Nadr, ibn Kinanat, ibn Khuzaymat, ibn Mudrikat, ibn Ilyas, ibn Mudar, ibn Nizar, ibn Ma'ad, ibn Adnan. And until here is authentic. From Muhammad to Adnan is authentic and well known. After that, as many Sahaba said, and many scholars said throughout history, after that, no one is sure about it. But what is sure? That Adnan is from the progeny of Ismail alayhi salam. But there are many generations between them. So no one knows exactly the lineage between Adnan and Ismail. But Adnan from Ismail alayhi salam. And his mother alayhi salatu wassalam, her name is Amina bint Wahab ibn Abd Manaf ibn Zuhrah ibn Kilab ibn Murrah. So Kilab, so it's the 5th grandfather of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that's all inshallah for tonight. Just quickly, what we can benefit from this in our life. A part of what I said about difficulty and hardship. Whenever we face anything, it's nothing compared to the Prophet ﷺ, the best of mankind. SubhanAllah, one of the nice points that here Imam Ibn Abdul Aziz al-Hanafi mentioned 2 dates for the birth of the Prophet ﷺ. And having different opinions about it gives the impression that it's not really important. No one knew for sure when he was born, much less celebrating and making it as Eid and festivals, and it's completely not from the original Islamic teachings. And just for your information, the celebration of what they call Mawlid started in the 5th century after Hijrah. So, and who started it? الدولة العبيدية. And they were not Sunni, and all Muslim scholars considered them not Muslims at all, because they followed the Ismaili madhab, which is one of the most radical Shi'i madhabs. So all Muslim scholars consider them non-Muslims. And those people, the one who started celebrating the birth of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So subhanAllah, just we can think about it. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't even mention the day he was born. He mentioned in a hadith that he was born on Monday. That's why he used to love fasting Monday. But he didn't mention the date, what month and what day. None of the Sahaba mentioned, none of the Sahaba even did anything special in that day. It was not quite known. It was just for the sake of knowledge, just for the sake of history, writing when he was born, not anything else. وجزاكم الله خيرا.